Okay, one of the things that I've been interested in for actually 3 decades is something I kept hearing about from students that I had from East Granby as we talked about local history and things like that. And it was mentioned a smallpox cemetery. Now at the time I lived in Windsor Locks and didn't really follow up on it. When I came to East Granby and became president of the East Granby Historical Society, I took more interest in the local history and its treasures around, whether they're hidden or seemingly lost. And the mysteries of the Smallpox Cemetery became something I wanted to get into. It turns out one of my neighbors, as a boy, a middle school youngster, did a 1-page report. And with it, he had this copy of a portion of the Hartford Courant that was done by Harry Batts, a photographer for the Courant. And it mentions this man, William Talbot, who was at the center of the lost stones, headstones. Anyhow, this told the story that he used in his paper. And it also became, and you notice it's 1950-ish, and the local historian, Ethel Wilson, started looking into it when she was president of the Historical Society. So some people had started doing some work. Why did this man take these stones? I mean, at the time, there was no doubt about it. People in East Granby knew the story. They knew the participants, okay? And did I skip it? No. Well, over the years, articles like this one by Bonnie Dressner of the Hartford Courant have helped to promote the notion of doing something about the cemetery. And this is in 1997, and it really started the ball rolling because donations started to come in, small ones. And we raised $600, which at that time seemed like a lot of money. But at that time, I went to the stone cutters, and you can see we had images of it. And I'll tell you where that is during this narrative. But to get this stone, which showed 3 children of Caleb Jr., or Caleb Holcomb, would cost $2,000 to replicate. And because there were 3 stones, the prices were going like $4,500, $5,000 or more to replicate individual stones. So I said, oh, well, this is a long-term project. But people had donated, and we kept it in a checking account that was in the name of the bank, so that it didn't earn any interest, but I also wasn't charged for it for my income tax. This was a nonprofit effort that we were trying to do, but it was taking a long time. But I wanted you to know how this came about, and to some degree, how the money came in. So over 18 years, we've had donations. Obviously, I'm a speaker. I'm a former school teacher, love to talk. And as a justice of the peace, and my wife and I have done speaking engagements together, as well as most recently the East Granby Historical Society donation of $500, really put us over the top for contacting with a stone cutter who not only could do the stones, but that was only half the problem. You'll see why. Getting it up the hill is just as big a problem, and you'll see how it was overcome. But this newsletter really was a catalyst of much of the communication that went on. It allowed me to put everything that I knew together in some fashion to answer some of the questions. Who did it, when, and so on. And how do we know about it, to document it? So it becomes very important in summer of 2008, and it has been seen by people across the country, and will continue to be so long as they Google Smallpox Cemetery, East Granby. But it was very helpful. And most recently, the article on Connecticut Explored, in Connecticut Explored, which was, it's a history magazine that started as the Hog River Journal in Hartford, but they're broadening it to include everything historic in the state to promote tourism and good history. And they did an article, or had me do the article, that explained about the problems in the restoration. One, announcing the stones are in. It's finished. And this is what it looked like. So this came just recently, last year. And it allowed the beauty of this magazine, and the magazine format has an advantage over journals, which tend to be very academic and not illustrated. Magazines focus on illustrations. So in one picture, you can see the old, what happened to it, that's a stone wall, people, and the new, just for one stone. So you see the before and after and how it came about to have it get to this point. Some mysteries that we had were answered. Where the cemetery was, when the headstones were taken, what did they look like, who took them, what did he do with the headstones. All those were part of the early history, and the local historian and the boy who did this first paper, junior high paper, knew about them. And I followed up on them as well. And what happened to the building that he created, in whose foundation the stones were placed, is in Bloomfield, on Tunxus Avenue. And it was something that you can go see today, because it's still exposed in the cellar of what is now a house. But when William Talbot took the stones, there was nothing there. He had the foundation built by a mason who was a friend of his and a neighbor, and as part of the process, stones that he collected. If you remember the first scene, I should have mentioned more about it, the first one where he's standing next to this foundation. You notice all these peculiar stones in terms of, say, one was a grist stone, a big one. Others are small. And there are Indian relics in there too. So he was an eccentric stone collector and collected stones all over the United States. Curiously, in all states but Maine. I don't know why. He died before I knew him, or I knew of him, but anyhow, he died. Okay, one of the things we wanted to make sure of is we had a good paper trail, an evidence trail that said there was a cemetery up there. Now this is very important, because the problem with ancient cemeteries, that is those whose burials are beyond 100 years, is there's no surface evidence. You know, very often people got buried on their farms or in a nice grove of trees. And then the families changed. The use of the land changes. And so it gets lost. A center cemetery is not going to get lost because it's in the center. We see it all the time. But something out in the hill like this one, this is a map from the Hale collection, which was a statewide inventory of headstones and their inscriptions that was done during the WPA project of the Great Depression. Hatchet Hill, it's not too clear here, is this road here that goes from Route 187 to 189. And Holcomb Street is this road here, and Route 20 here. Somewhere around here is the cemetery, at least as identified in 1934. So we say, Kat?
Is this the Smallpox one?
Yes, yes. The Hale Cemetery map then was evidence that there was a smallpox cemetery, and the men who are former professors who were hired by the government to do this inventory wrote down what the stones said. So in 1934, they were there, and that's what they said. We also know Julian Kaiser, one of the several owners of the hill, and was a vice president of a paper company in Pequannock, kept a small map for his workman to show where the graves were, and pointed out that there was, in fact, a diagonal line representing a wire fence, a barbed wire fence, and then the stone wall. So we knew those parameters, physical parameters, were there. Also, we know from land records and the probate records for the Holcombs, it mentions the family burial ground along the wall, stone wall. Finally, eyewitnesses told the story as well. They used to come up to this place and drive up, right up, around the time or just after World War I. And Mr. Viets of Hatchet Hill, when he was alive, told me they used to go up for picnics and be there among the stones, and that in fact the cemetery, which I'll show you more of, but here's the stone wall, and the cemetery goes back about 150 feet, and I'm standing about where the trail is, the Metacama Trail, and you'll see other shots of this. But the point I'm making, he mentioned that it had an iron fence around it that was used for the World War I war effort. Sadly, it was cast iron, and they couldn't use that. So it had ended up as junk. Anyhow, if you go up from Hatchet Hill Road, you'll see the Blue Blaze sign, and if you took that and went through and up to the second wall, you would see, you're coming from that side here, you would see this wall. And on this tree, there's a sign right now. You won't see this, however. That was one of the stones that was there from the time it was put in 1793 for the twins of Caleb Holcomb. And his daughter, there was a daughter who died just before they did, a few years before, but they were all infants. But this is other evidence, physical photographs that were taken of the cemetery by some people like the owners, the Seymour family who owned it and donated it to the East Granby Library. Now this one is, and I hated to do it, but the room downstairs in the cellar of this house was so dark it was difficult to get a good picture, so we used white chalk, which didn't do it any harm, but it did obviously show everything, and this was the one that was used in the current article. There's also physical evidence right in the ground itself. Now you can say, well, gee, that looks like stones everywhere, and you're right. But when you took all of the humus, all the leaves away, you know, for 150 feet, and you spread them out, you can see the bare ground, but every now and then you see these stones that are laid down in some sort of rectangular pattern, which was not unheard of out west with shallow burials. And when the archaeologists came here, you know, they mentioned, yeah, the ground is probably not that deep here. And so in order to keep animals away, they were buried in stone and filled in with dirt too. So it's not unheard of to see evidence of stone on the surface. And it was very important because it paralleled the handwritten map that showed where the graves were, at least a few of them. This is another photograph of from the Seymours, and what's important here is the relative position. And the number that we have give us a clue to which stone it was, whether it was for Ruth Ford, or whether it was for Joshua Holcomb, or it was the one for the 3 children. Ruth Ford was his grandson, a daughter, by his, Joshua's daughter, Martha. And here's another view in the cellar. It's a bad one, I apologize. But you can see how it's cemented right in with the stones. the field stones. And you know, the first thing we thought, well, can we salvage this? And it became apparent that with the settling of the building above the concrete and stone of the foundation, that in fact the stones were splitting vertically in the back. The one with the 3 children that this one here, you could knock on it and it was hollow, you know. So there's no way that we could salvage the originals, which was always our hope, to get back to where we could put them back. There was no way. And then the second thing is, can we replicate them? Well, you can see from them, they had the soul effigies, you had all of the, you know, fancy work. To do that like that would have been too expensive. We couldn't afford it. It turns out John Zito here, who is a stone cutter from a long family of stone cutters in East Granby, had an inventory of stones that probably his grandfather had. And so we were able to see what he had without having to order special sizes. And so we were able to locate, quote, cheap granite. It was cheap in the sense that he doesn't have to invest any money, so we were able to work a good price. So anyhow, we went up at the cemetery using the photographs, using the maps, using the ground evidence. We were able to discern where the likely spots are for the 3 of them. This is one closest to where the children were buried, which we think was here, but there's a tree where all those stones, surface stones were. So we wanted to stay clear of some of that. Also, the one that's over here, we'll see this again, I realized that's too far out. It really should be brought here and represent Ruth. Because Ruth and her grandfather, Joshua, died within 2 days of each other. And we're certain she died of smallpox. But it's called the Smallpox Cemetery because Joshua's cause of death is on his stone. The children here, the 3 children here, we're not so sure that it was smallpox, although there was smallpox in the area in 1793 and 1788, when the 3 children died. But they didn't put a stone up here until the children, the twins, died. After that, Caleb and his wife leave for New York with the rest of their family. And interestingly enough, the son's name was Caleb, who died here. And they named 2 other sons Caleb. The third one lived to be 80. Okay? But Ruth would be buried here, and Ruth's mother and father and their children moved out to New York as well. Anyhow, we got a good deal from John, and we felt we were ready to do some planning to get them to cut these. Yeah, the stone that is here, this is the one that was moved and put in between here. This is a guy that happened to be around, you know. But I wanted to show you there was other evidence. I mentioned the barbed wire. The barbed wire was attached to this tree, and it went diagonally back to the highest point in the stone wall. And it went diagonally across the cemetery, so that from the stone wall to where it went to the edge of the ledge was about 100 feet. We don't know whether there are other people buried out here in the cemetery. That's not a good place to show you. But anyhow, we got the stone cutter to give us a deal on these. It is not replicated in the sense of ancient. Anyone who looks at it knows it's granite. It's not the stuff of ancient, you know, cemeteries. But it's all we could afford. And it's 4 or 5 inches thick. It's deep. It'll last a long time. What's interesting on this one, I took literary license here. You know, have you ever seen a stonecutter's mistake erased? Sometimes chiseling it out leaves a hole. The original stone said 161. It was the rave of the Holcomb genealogy. They highlighted, here we have hope for us. The 90-year-old, you're still young, But it was an error, and the local information that we had on his age was in fact 61, not 161. And here are the three children. This is a wet spot. It was being hosed down to get rid of the dust. And you can see the information on it. But that's also in the article that we wrote. But there are unanswered questions that we still had to keep in mind. Why? Why did he take them? Well, you get somewhat of a clue that this guy was an eccentric. He collected stones. But memorial stones of living people? It didn't ring rational. How many graves were in the cemetery? Frankly, we didn't know. All we had since the 30s evidence of are these three. But given the photographs, they had to be further into the cemetery than those that are closer to the ledge. So we determined how many stones there were. We'll see in a minute. How much was it going to cost? Of course, you get a rude economic awakening, even though your hopes are nice. I mean, what is it? Your motives are fine. Only what? $6,000-7,000? You got to be kidding. Anyway, exactly where were the graves we were sure of, and you'll see I've answered some of those questions already. But isolation out there, like any of the cemeteries that are ancient and lost, is isolation. They're in the woods, they're in the trees, And some don't even have a headstone when they were buried, let alone those who had headstones, and nature takes its course and water comes and splits them, or somebody just wants to clear the grass and moves them to the side so you never see where the graves are. All you know is they're headstones that may belong somewhere. And it also helps the fact that changing ownership, if it was a Holcomb burial ground and the Holcombs were still there, there would be some kind of motivation, I think, to take care of it. But they moved out. That is, after Joshua died, his sons lived around there, and by 1809, Caleb's family is picking up and leaving. The Fords are leaving. The other children are still around, but they sell the land. So things start to change. And by the 20th century, the Seymours and Julian Kaiser acquire the land, and it's eventually bought by the quarry people because it is, in fact, basalt. It's the building material of modern roads and buildings. Now, I wanted to take a side note because nobody knows about this. Going back, they don't know about Julian Kaiser. So I thought I'd show you a couple of sidebar slides that if you were in the cemetery where the sign is, okay, and you'll see the sign, up about 100 yards at the most, there's a little, hardly noticeable diversion of the trail that goes around like this. And that little diversion goes to the best overlook on the trail. It was one of his favorite places. And this is what it looks like. This is what it looks like as you're going up the trail. The trail, the Metacomet Trail, stays to the right and essentially it goes over here and comes out further down, okay? And there's this open area, and this tree wasn't there when we first started working on this trail. It fell down. And for a time, it became a nice sitting place for people who are, in fact, camped out illegally, you know, but it's the best overview up here. But people could put a tent up without building a fire. But on the other side of that dying tree, well, that's the best overlook. And the brush is starting to get kind of heavy. But you can see the Farmington River and the valley. It's really quite nice. And it's well worth looking. But see the log? This is dead now. What's that? A footstone? Charles Julian Kaiser. This was his favorite. I don't know. Okay. Julian Kaiser had a great interest in it. He's the one that had this hand-drawn map for his worker to keep track of where the graves were and the wire fence, because they were concerned about the cows going over the grave. I mean, that's tradition passed on for generations. But you can see trees are all over the place, but they're not old trees. So you can well imagine cows would have used the top of the Hatchet Hill for pasturage. But the land no longer belonged to the Holcomb family, and that might explain how it kind of was left there deserted, unknown, except to the local historians and kids who were up there. And the trail has been there since the 20s. Or actually, I think the trail people started in the 1930s. And so this was on their itinerary to walk it. The main culprit in the thinking, anyway, that this might be a long-lost cemetery that's going to go anyway, was the quarry. And you can understand why. This is a development down here off of 187, and it looks like there might be a cloud up here, but the trail is over this way, I believe. The cemetery, I'm not sure of just how far up it is, but it's not very far from this point. And so when this quarry was first brought to our attention, my wife happened to be on the Planning and Zoning Commission at this time, 2003. And the question came up, well, what about the cemetery? And most looked at, what cemetery? Ron Carey didn't know about the cemetery, or they pretended they didn't know about the cemetery, okay? So from that point, we gathered all the evidence we've been telling you, photographs, the land, the probate, on, to prove that this was an ancient burial ground. And to this day, it is marked that way. And they marked it on the plans for 2003, and just recently, the quarry plan for 2014 to 27 shows an expansive, here this is Hatchet Hill Road, and you can see and this is the ridge, okay? And it's hard to see, but there is right about here, there is a pond. You can see it on the originals. But what I'm trying to say is the cemetery is very close to the line. And it became one of, wait a minute, they better know how far they are. And as a matter of fact, I looked at this at home just this morning, and what's in it are the pictures that you're going to see in this program, showing the cemetery, showing the sign on the tree that the selectmen required, and actually the stakes in the ground that you've been seeing. And they measured from the ridge edge in, and where there's a 100-foot buffer by law now, that is zoning law, that's right in the middle of the cemetery, and it's before you get to the stones. And they realized they needed more space. as a result of the state archaeologists coming to visit. And so it went out to 150 feet. But in walking the grounds with the quarry people, the foreman, and the general manager, it became apparent that we really need a 200-foot buffer at that point. But now that these stones are in, it's a better visual stop point. I wish I had blinking lights and, because somebody with a bulldozer is going to be coming up there to clear that land, and I'm afraid they're just going to bulldoze everything, and oh, the cemetery was there. Anyhow, yeah. Anyhow, the ridge was going to go away anyway. I'm trying to give Mr. Talbot the benefit of the doubt. No laws to protect cemeteries, ancient or otherwise. Lost or forgotten or stolen history. Once the stones are taken, where's the evidence? Because sextons don't necessarily put how many feet from the tree or from the wall or whatever. And this was family burial, not a sexton, organized ecclesiastical society and so on. Lost, forgotten, or stolen history, trending towards farms, to developments. The interest of money and profit has an overriding effect. And the stones that you saw in the wall, imagine one being shipped to California so they can put it above their mantle, whether they're a hokum or not. And when I've done articles, and I've taken pictures and put it in the article, and I said, this is going out to God knows where. And I'm promoting this beautiful stone with a Revolutionary War veteran, and it's slate, where it's located in Killingly. I said, what am I doing? You understand what I'm saying? Because there's an underground market in memorials. Anyhow, all these factors played a part in the Smallpox cemetery history. All we know is the earliest burials are before 1784. That these 5 individuals who were buried in the Smallpox cemetery, so-called, were put there in those years. And they appear to be at the end of the cemetery, suggesting everything back is younger. But we don't know how young. And if you know the Holcomb family, you know there are a hell of a lot of them. And there are a lot that don't have where they're buried, including Joshua's wife, his brothers. They were all in this area. Were any of them buried up there? I suspect they are. But which ones? When? Gone but not forgotten. Proof of the cemetery's existence, we've been over again. We don't have to go through it again. It was family, eyewitnesses, paper trail, and the fieldstone evidence on the surface. This is what the cemetery looked like from about 50 feet in, looking towards where the stones eventually come. This is my frozen wife sitting. And this is John Rusnock, if those from East Granby know. John is the president of the Center Cemetery Association. And so I had asked him, does that give you authority over other cemeteries? He said, no, only this one. So associations have definite responsibilities for cemeteries. There was no association for this. But we uncovered more of the stone, and that one right there was kind of uncovered because it looked to John like it could have been a headstone. But it was so flaky, it was breaking up, and there were no pieces that had anything that looked like lettering or imagery. But you can see the second wall here going out. And there's a little gap in here where we believe there was a road that came up here and went between the headstones. And there's the tree that had the barbed wire. The surface evidence becomes more evident once the leaves were moved. And you can see the wall is over here, And there's nothing in between here and here. So, you know, you're not trying to make things fit, but you're trying to say, well, what does it show us? Clear it away. And you can see these little pockets of surface stones that had a general rectangular form, suggesting graves. Up to 9 burial places appear to be there in the cemetery. 5 of them we know. That's Joshua and his 4 grandchildren. And this is a personal point. My wife and I have 4 grandchildren. We have 1 boy and 3 girls. Joshua had 1 boy and 3 girls who died. He had many others because all of his children had children. Was it legal? Was it illegal? In the absence of laws? The people around there, like Mr. Viets of Hatchet Hill, who as a young man visited the cemetery with his family for the picnics. His pointed remark was, it was not the right thing to do. And he knew the owner of the property who had, he said, gave permission to Mr. Talbot to take the stones. To correct the wrong, then, is the mission that we had. But to do it, the state statutes related to cemeteries were not easy to get through. They're somewhat complicated because who's in charge? Essentially everyone. Too many and no one. Just like government, right? The bureaucracy. Who makes the decision? Oops. The Connecticut statutes, the definitions for them, and they were just revised about 2 years ago and updated. So I was pleased to see that because the pages that I was working with had been given to me by the head of the Connecticut Historical Commission, which had statutory oversight with historic cemeteries. Anyhow, the definitions and details matter and they change. Control and oversight is vested in everyone and no one, or just a few who don't want to know. Few decision makers, several jurisdictions, most concerned taking really the damaging of the cemeteries. Very few with putting something back in the cemetery, the way we were trying to do, okay? So it was sort of a, whoa. This is why I refer to it as no good deed goes unpunished. You know, you're trying to do some good, and fortunately, things have come together. But this is the section of the statute that relates to cemeteries, including resetting liabilities and things like that. I didn't want to get into penalties. I said, I'm taking a risk enough. So, you know, who's in charge? Is the property owner? Actually, the property owners have no say in it. And to some degree, that's the problem, because they feel they have a vested right in the property. And just the idea of being able to get to a cemetery becomes going over their land. And the state law does not allow them to preclude access to a known cemetery, a designated cemetery. And so that has been a rub for property owners. Does the probate court? Yes. They have historically, they continue to have oversight. Cemetery Association, if it's formed for that particular property. Ecclesiastical Society, again, it's a church. And it's their church cemetery that they have responsibility for. Sexton, well, that's the one who's actually burying them. They have to keep records and would have a say in where a burial took place if they had jurisdiction over that cemetery. The one thing that's saving grace for me as someone trying to do a good deed was the Board of Selectmen, specifically James Hayden. But he didn't know he was the cemetery board, okay, until we showed him. the law, and he had Don Holtman, who was then the town attorney, look it up. And so it became very important for him to see his own role as the oversight board, as the board of first selectman in the board of selectmen. But it also showed, as he went through this, that the probate court had an oversight. But not only the probate court, and here's what was throwing me. Jack Shanahan was the head of the historical commission, the state historical commission. He had already seen what I had to do, and he was all for it. Well, from this hand to this hand, the historical commission was ended. The state had the shifting of boards and commissions. So that became the Connecticut Committee on Arts, Tourism, Culture, History, and Film. That has a vested interest in cemeteries, right? Yeah. Right. And within a year, because nobody could say all that, and it didn't provide an acronym, you can say CREC or whatever, it became the Connecticut Commission on Culture and Tourism. Within a year, that was put under the Department of Economic and Community Development. So all within 5 years, the bureaucracy overseeing history in the state and ancient cemeteries fall under their purview. Somehow, the names change. But the State Historic Preservation Officer is a member of DEC. Okay? So I call him on the phone. We have this ancient cemetery. I said, oh yeah? I can't come out. I'm so busy, I can't do anything. But let me think about it. I'll call you. Don't call me, I'll call you. Well, I never heard from him again. It was interesting. I saw him when Newgate Prison was being discussed about getting it all fixed up. He had a lot to say there. I hope you're not related to him because I'm not happy with him. But the state archaeologist, and I'm sure you have had him as a speaker. Something? Yeah.
I think so. I'm trying to get him to come back.
Yeah, he's great. He's great. Superman. Anyhow, he came, and the Connecticut Gravestone Network, a friend of mine, Ruth Shapley Brown, came, and we walked up to the cemetery, and we're walking around, and I wanted his opinion because one of the questions is, where exactly, down to the foot, certainly a yard, but a foot, are the graves? And I said, ground penetrating radar. That would do it. These are little kind of tin cans that go around and you move them around. Cost $2,000 a day. All right. So I thought, before I knew the price. How about 10 minutes? Anyhow, the thought of using that to see disturbed ground. That's how you know there's a grave. Because the ground looks one way to the sound, and then you can see mixtures. And one thing Valentoni said, given the depth of the ground and the amount of rock in it, it probably won't work here. Might work in a meadow, but not here. So that was it on that. But he was now well aware of where the cemetery was. And so he provided some expertise, at least to the town and to Ron Carey, or at least Tilcon Tommaso. So in their plan of development is his notion that 150 feet will be fine, a better buffer to protect this. His testimony was this is historic. This is archaeological, historic, which means right now that's the only thing on the ridge that's holding that from being taken over the whole ridge and becoming a plain. Except they want a buffer, the planning and zoning want 100 feet. Well, we need 200 feet. The one who's helped the most is not Mr. Zellman. He told me the interesting Sidebar story. I was a delegate to his convention. He's a Democrat, and I was a delegate from East Granby. I said, I want to meet this guy. You know, so Jim and I were the delegates to this Democratic convention down in Bloomfield. And he was unopposed, and he's a good probate judge. And I mentioned what was happening in the legislature, you know, about changing who has responsibility for cemeteries. And he says, nobody wants to lose power. Meaning having his name on a list of, you know, was still fine, even if he didn't do anything. Okay, but anyhow, Jim Hayden wrote this letter, and most importantly was this main part. The Burial Ground Authority has to get the sign up of any ancient burial ground within a certain time, okay? The Burial Ground Authority, at least 90 days before commencing a renovation, has provided written notice to the probate court. That's what that letter was, having jurisdiction over the place. Now keep in mind, he's from Bloomfield, and with the unification of probate districts, we don't even have a local probate judge. He's a regional judge. So instead of 7 cemeteries in East Granby, he's got 50 or 100. You know, it's not a high priority for him because people are dying today, and he's not worried about that other thing. But nevertheless, here's the state law. Provide a written notice to the probate having jurisdiction over the location of the burial place. Upon notice of such hearing, the Burial Ground Authority shall not proceed with such renovation except by order of the probate court. We never heard from the probate court. Never heard. And where am I in this legal process? No good deed goes unpunished. I was feeling it until I've got the stones. I've already had them cut. Half the budget is gone for the stones. Now the other half is to put them in. And I said, what's happening? When are we going to get the okay? Well, our selectmen talked to the judge. None of the state people got involved, but it was a quiet understanding. We put the sign up and have gotten a lot of attention from this. The trail goes right along here, up north, and here's the wall. One of the things we had to find are hookums. Well, they're all over the place. Are you a hokum? No. No. I could have just gone down the street and gotten your letter then. No. But, okay, but we had to look for them, and there were a lot of them. Fortunately, in doing the research on the Joshua, I knew who all of his children were, and by checking the census records in the 1800s, I knew there were quite a few around. And it turns out one was right there in West Suffield and had been a student of mine. And so, I called her on the phone, and I told her what her lineage was. As a matter of fact, I sent her a letter. I said, could you contact the selectmen, just indicating that it's okay that we put these stones back. Somehow, through the article, 2008, we're getting emails from all over the country. I am, but I'm telling them, talk to Jim. So he's getting these emails from people saying they're descendants of Joshua or Caleb or Ford, and you have our permission to put the stones back. And they're, of course, going to the article, 2008. You're known internationally now. And the documentation addressing state laws provided, and so on. He sends a letter, and he talks to the judge, and essentially signs off on it, but not right away. We're waiting for the judge. Waiting. Finally, as a result of the emails, this is in 2013 now, Tom, I'm getting they must be hiking the trail again and see the sign that he had me put up. As a matter of fact, he helped me put it up because he wanted to know where the cemetery was. And so he held the sign. Well, use the hatchet. He looked at me strangely that I was carrying a hatchet. What am I going to do with the hatchet, you know? But we got it on the tree. People must be hiking the trail. Can you tell me more about what's happening and what's the latest? 12 months after the contract, the stones are cut and paid for, waiting, nothing in writing to go ahead with the project. Weather's cooperating. And finally, I'm after Jim, what's happening? We met the other day and we agreed that it's a worthwhile project. That was enough for me. You know, I wasn't going to ask him, can I have proof of that? Yeah. Okay. No, I haven't done that. But they endorsed the project, restoration, finally. The challenge, then the stone cutters. Hatchet Hill is a half mile away from the cemetery. And they had to go through the CLMP gate, which was locked. Fortunately, I had the combination. Because of work I was doing with CLMP's archaeologists to make sure the power lines and removal of the tree didn't involve the cemetery. Metacomet Blue Blaze Trail is not very wide. Some spots it's like this, 2 trees, rocks and so on. So we had to get a couple tons of equipment and material. Well, not me. I'm paying him to do the work. So I just wanted him to get up there. And so we tried to help him with ways in which we might use volunteers and others. It turns out we had a volunteer who had a 4x4 vehicle and was willing to drive it. So the beginning, it starts. These are the 2 people who work. This is John Zito, the stonecutter, and this is his primary worker. Been with him for many years. And you can see the work that is being done here. And this is the vehicle they're using, okay? And here's the volunteer. Interestingly, he was a Higley. Now this is important. You've all heard of the Hatfields and McCoys? Right, the Appalachian Mountains? I'm talking to this guy. I'm up here just kind of supervising. Here's Holcomb. Here's Higley. And he tells me, I didn't know who this was for. If I knew it was a Holcomb, I wouldn't be doing this. I said, what do you mean? I'm a local historian. I've never heard this, you know? What do you mean? Oh, the Holcombs and the Higleys have hated each other for centuries. Really? And then I started thinking about that, and I said, wait a minute. If you went from the cemetery and you went down that way a half a mile, Samuel Higley had a house there. And it was said in our local history that if he and that house could see both the Farmington River to the west and the Connecticut River to the east. So he had to be high enough. He's on the same hill, which means Higley didn't own it by the time Holcomb owned it and had a family burial ground in the 1700s. Higley died in around 1720, 30, but the Holcombs must have bought the hill. This guy was a great guy. We couldn't have done it without him. But I learned some local history I didn't know. And they worked on cement, and they went very deep. And you can see, they speak for themselves. And this looks like a motley crew. This is the brother of the stonecutter. This is his son. This is an old guy who just likes to talk, me and the workers and so on. But yeah, it actually looks pretty nice. And this was videotaped too. And it turns out it was my son-in-law did this for Windsor Television. Did he give me a copy? No, he gave his friend John Zito a copy. So I have to buy a copy. I haven't done that yet. But he has shots of the work, and it is on their community television program. So we did it because we had a lot of help, certainly volunteers and donations, relatives, the Board of Selectmen, certainly John Zito, he was paid for his work, but he put a lot of himself into it in the planning, just getting that stuff up there. My Lord. And that four-wheel drive buggy, so where the trail was too narrow, they went around it. So they were improvising all the way, and it was truly very nice. And this is the way it looks. And, you know, was it something that some liked? I got this email in September last year. My name is Melissa, and I'm an avid hiker of the northern Connecticut area. Today I hiked the Blue Trail on the Hatchet Hill Road for the first time in probably 2 years and was surprised to stumble upon the Smallpox Cemetery being restored there. I did a little online research, found our article in 2008 when I got home and read about what a part you played in making sure the burial plots were properly marked. And I just wanted to let you know that it really touched me that you cared enough to do that. Not many people would invest in the time and effort you did taking on the project, and so thank you for doing what you did. But here's what I really am touched by, because I feel it every time I go up there. I found it to be very memorable and contemplative hike, and appreciate what you did to make it so. Thanks for caring. So just to sit there and reflect. That's what a memorial is, right? Think about these children, because their story is there. I mean, they were 12 months old, these young ones. Never had a chance. But I do believe in the afterlife. And I believe every time we think of somebody, they live in some way. So getting that from Melissa was really very personally rewarding. It took a long time, got little help from the state, no help from the probate court, no help from the quarry people, delayed restoration and so on. We probably broke a number of laws. We won't speak of them again. Nevertheless, it was worth it. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Tom, that was great.
When were they finally installed?
They could have been installed, as I said, a year or 60 months ago, because we had December, January of that year when we hadn't had a frost yet, you know, really cold. But then we had to put it off. So it wasn't done until, you notice they have jackets on. So I believe it was in the spring of 14.
14.
Yeah. Yes,
How many stones did you find the word smallpox?
just one.
So why do you call it the Smallpox Cemetery instead of the Holcomb Cemetery?
That's a good question. Because the person who came as part of the WPA project called it the Smallpox Cemetery to differentiate it from the other cemeteries in town that he was inventorying. It's not uncommon. There are about a dozen smallpox cemeteries around the state of Connecticut, all part of the Hale collection, and they're called smallpox cemeteries.
Was there a certain smallpox epidemic
Yes.
going on at that time?
Yes. As a matter of fact, Martha, his wife, Joshua's wife, paid the doctor $1 for the recent epidemic that took care of, you know, obviously the grandchildren that didn't survive. Our child is Ruth, and those that did survive would have gotten through it. Not everybody died of smallpox. Certain kinds of smallpox are very, very terrible, almost 100% casualty, but most are like 20, 30%. But they leave you scarred, blindness, hearing loss, and it's something that most of us, given the hair colors you have, got when we were in grade school. We got a smallpox, on the arm. And we had to watch it and put a cover for the scab, and, you know, and we were protected. Whether we're protected now, though, they argue that we probably wore off that. So smallpox is still a very serious thing, and the whole issue of banning it across the world became an international political issue and health issue. One, we don't want it to spread, but yet, if it did, who's got the seeds of inoculation, except from the people who have it and are dying. But it was very controversial. When they lived, inoculation was not common. It was very scary because inoculation, as opposed to vaccination that we had as kids, they had to take the pus from a living person and put that in your arm. And there was a certain percentage, people more susceptible to its effects in actually getting the disease. Others, because it's a mild form that you get, others survived it and in fact had immunization. It wasn't until the Revolutionary War, George Washington ordered that his troops get it, because the British had already done that. The Queen or the King, George, had taken it to prove that it was safe, relatively, okay? And so the British troops had the inoculation. They were immune to it. So the blankets, when they found somebody who had it, well, this is true, sent the blankets in among the slaves who were working for George and among our own troops, and spread the smallpox. And the Connecticut prisoners who were on the New Jersey in New York Harbor got sick, had smallpox, and they released them back to Danbury and to Connecticut, and they came back among the population. So it became obvious that being unprotected was not the way to do it. And so he required his people, his men, in fact, to have inoculation. Yes, ma'am.
Where was the Holcomb House in relation to the cemetery? Was it at the bottom of the hill? Or?
It has to be. It has to be. I still don't know because within 30 years, the Holcombs on the hill are gone. They're traveling all over the country, Ohio, New York. So I never found an old house. I thought it was the Wilson place on Holcomb Street, but apparently not. That was a Clark homestead, and there's another old one on Holcomb Street. But it would have had to have been there, down there, yeah.
So you only found one grave with the word smallpox on it?
Mm-hmm.
And were there other graves that were dated
Yeah.
close to that date?
Yes. The oldest one is his granddaughter, who died 2 days earlier. And then he died she died on the 15th, he died on the 17th.
But no word smallpox?
No, but it's clear. The young get affected more than, and the old get affected. And it's interesting, my experience, I've done smallpox research across the state and started gathering a database on people who have died of smallpox. And it's interesting how many die in April. If I was to give it a month, smallpox month, it was April, where the predominant number of people die, April, May. Why? I don't know. Maybe it's like we're emerging from the winter and our strength is not up. I don't know. But it happens. Yes?
Do you know where Joshua Holcomb lived?
No, that was a question here. He lived on Holcomb Street. No doubt about that.
Mm-mm.
Yeah. But that, I'd have to go through the land records. And the last time I did, you're talking about a dozen, at the City Hall up here, a dozen pages just on land that he owned in his probate records and an inventory. He owned land everywhere. He was a very wealthy man, if land is how we judge wealth. And he divided it all up among his sons and daughters. Yes, sir.
How far back does the institution of the probate court go? I'm thinking of that 1784 to 93. That would have still been part of Simsbury, wouldn't it?
Yes.
And did the probate court emerge shortly after that?
No, actually it was probably part of Hartford at that time. Simsbury probably was part of Hartford. Most of the area was Hartford. But as the population grew, they separated. And we had 169 towns, certainly, and all of them had their own probate district. Well, maybe the exception was about 10. So we had a lot of districts. And in someone's wisdom about reorganization of our government, we've got them joined together all over the state. So we have fewer districts, but they have to go further and further afield. And we, as deceased people or spouses of deceased people, have to work with strangers, people who don't know us. Whereas the other way, you know, we had someone who's a probate judge that we elected and who lived next to us. You know, so it's more distant from us, like so much in our government today. Okay? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Is there extra handouts in that for anyone who can get them?
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.